I want to start this course off by talking about person-first language. This is a very important topic for me and should be used and practiced by you so that it comes naturally when you're speaking. Terminology is very important to us as educators. The words we choose to use can affect our children in positive and negative ways and leave lasting impressions on them for years. Think about a time when a teacher in elementary or middle school said something to you or to the classroom that left a lasting impression on you for years later. I bet many of you could do that with ease. When we're using terminology as it pertains to disabilities, it is really important that we use person-first language. Many times a word is demeaning, even if the speaker does not intend that connotation. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is mental retardation versus intellectual disability. At the turn of the 20th century, many professionals would use terms like moron and idiot to refer to individuals with intellectual disabilities. This was not demeaning at that time and was widely accepted. However, through the years, the connotation of those words became very negative and demeaning. Around the 1950s, the term mental retardation was used when referring to people with intellectual disabilities. Now, when we hear the word retarded, it has a negative and demeaning connotation and should never be used. That term was used to refer to people with intellectual disabilities until recently. In October of 2010, Congress passed Rosa's Law, and that changed references to mental retardation in specified federal laws to now intellectual disability, and references to mentally retarded individuals to an individual with an intellectual disability. I do want to clarify that labels are not always bad. Labels do assist professionals in identifying characteristics and best practices when working with individuals with disabilities. However, labels can cause stereotypes, and then those stereotypes create a negative connotation with certain terminology. That's just unfortunately how our society works, and the big key takeaway here is how we use that label and to show respect to individuals. So what can you say? So use handicap to refer to a barrier created by people or the environment. Use disability to indicate a functional limitation that interferes with a person's mental, physical, or sensory abilities, such as walking, talking, hearing, and learning. Some other terminology that needs to be cleared up is the handicapped and handicap terminology. We don't want to say people are handicapped. We don't say handicapped. We don't say he's handicapped. We want to use handicap to refer to a barrier, not a person. We need to say accessible parking instead of handicapped parking. And I know this is a hard one, especially for me, but I'm sure that eventually handicapped parking will be replaced with accessible parking. You want to use handicap to refer to a barrier created by people or the environment. Use disability to indicate a functional limitation that interferes with a person's mental, physical, or sensory abilities, such as walking, talking, hearing, and learning. Using person-first language. So moving on to person-first language. This is not a fad or political correctness. It is something that we all need to do as respectful humans. This eliminates stereotypes and focuses on the person as a human, not focusing first on the disability. An easy way to remember this is you always refer to the person first, then the disability. And this does take practice. If you practice this, then it will become automatic and more comfortable in your daily conversations. You will start to be able to pick up on the incorrect usage and hear the difference. I do want to warn you is that many publications and online resources, they do use person-first language. Many of them do. But however, many do not. That doesn't mean that the resource isn't valuable. It just means that the authors or creators were not educated on the appropriateness of this person-first language. First and foremost, we want to use the person's name when referring to them. We would not want to be referred to as the Italian guy or the blonde girl. We want to be referred to by our name. When professionally speaking, we would always want to use person first language. Some examples of this would be a student with an intellectual disability, a person with autism spectrum disorder, an individual with Tourette syndrome. You do not say autistic child, learning disabled, or special ed kids. This is a big one. Special ed kids. We hear this all the time. We would say instead the kids who receive special education services. And we'll have more about this later in the presentation, and we'll practice using some person-first terminology. The next point, portraying successful people with disabilities as heroes, raises the stereotype that all people with disabilities are lower achievers. You can probably think of a lot of times that you have heard or seen people with disabilities portrayed as superhuman or being heroic at achieving something. And even though people usually don't mean to demean or insult individuals with disabilities this way, it does. It's rude, and it also, like I said before, raises that stereotype that all people with disabilities are lower achievers. Do not centralize a disability by saying afflicted with, crippled with, a victim of, or suffers from. Instead, just use that person-first language. You want to avoid dramatizing the disability. Even though, like on the news, or you might see some other media avenues like Facebook would say, oh, they suffer from autism spectrum disorder, or they're crippled from, and typically they wouldn't say crippled from an orthopedic impairment, but crippled from spina bifida. You don't want to say this. This is insulting, and it almost sounds like you're victimizing the person with the disability. Do not use generic labels, so like the retarded or the deaf. I do want to point out with that second statement there, the deaf, there are some exceptions to rules, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. This is a tricky one with the deaf, and I'll get into that later. I'll explain why it's tricky. You want to emphasize abilities, not limitations. Here are some examples. So, children with disabilities. That is how you would want to say it. You would not want to say disabled children. He is confined to a wheelchair. You definitely don't want to say he's confined to a wheelchair. He uses a wheelchair. Like I said before, you don't say the special ed kids. You would say kids with special needs, or kids with learning disabilities. You don't want to say he suffers from autism. You want to say he has autism. You definitely don't say retarded. You would say intellectual disability. And you would not say he heroically competes despite his disability. He is an athlete. That last statement, that's dramatizing it, and we do not want to do that. Like I said before, there are exceptions to every rule. The key here is to respect the individual or groups of individuals. So, for example, whenever I talk about the exceptions to the rules, a lot of people in the deaf community have deaf pride, and if you've ever taken ASL courses, you'd learn that they are very proud, and they do want to be referred to as the deaf community with a capital D. They don't typically use the person first language, and that's okay. But if we're professionally speaking, or you're writing in this class or any other class, a rule of thumb is to use person first language unless the group or groups of people direct you to do so or tell you differently. Let's try to change these terms into more respectful person first terms. So the first one, it's easy. A mentally retarded child. We would say a child with an intellectual disability. We're saying the person first. He suffers from muscular dystrophy. We would not, how would we change that? Think about it. We would not want to say suffers. It's he has muscular dystrophy. Person first. She is crippled. She has an orthopedic impairment. So we don't want to say crippled. That's very outdated, and it has a negative connotation to that. So we would say she has an orthopedic impairment, or she has spina bifida. The next one, help the disabled. Well, we could just say people with disabilities. You don't want to say help, and also you don't want to say disabled, because that's labeling that entire group. And help can really come off as being rude if you're saying help the disabled. Many people who have disabilities are very independent, and they're very proud of that independence. Next one, she's autistic. She has autism. They are severely learning disabled. Now this one, it's okay to say severe, but instead you would say they have a severe learning disability in reading. We are going to get, I believe it's week 3 or 4, we are going to talk about learning disabilities, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of the misconceptions with learning disabilities and other disabilities. But right now, we would say they have a severe learning disability in reading. During this course, or any profession or social atmosphere you are in, you need to use person first language, unless you are directed or told differently by the preference of a group that I talked about earlier. I want to give a shout out to Mrs. Marianne Shaw for allowing me to use her materials for this course. She did wonderful with this whole course. She was somebody that I learned a lot from. I hope you all learned a lot about person first language, and that it starts to become a natural way of speaking in your life.